A wooden shutter opens onto a gray morning in the year 1340. Smoke from a banked hearth drifts low across a packed earth floor. Outside, a rooster calls from a thatched stable, and the bells of a village church begin their slow, uneven ringing. Beyond the fields, a cart moves along a frozen road. Long before sunrise, in a low cottage on the edge of an English village, the goodwife rises to wake the fire. In the English Midlands of the year 1340, a typical villain's cottage was a long, narrow building of crucked timber and wattle and daub walls, perhaps 6 paces wide, and shared at one end with a few hens or a single cow. The family slept together on straw mattresses near the central hearth, which had no chimney. Smoke drifted up through a hole in the thatch and out into the morning air. The goodwife, as the senior woman of the household was called in manor rolls, rose first to coax the embers back to life. She lifted away the iron-bound lid that had covered the coals through the night, the curfew, from the French couvre-feu, a practice English law had inherited from the days of William the Conqueror. A pot of yesterday's pottage hung on a chain over the fire, and she stirred it slowly before fetching water from the village well, often shared by 20 households or more. In Hale Selwyn, in Worcestershire, manor court rolls from the year 1349 record peasant households whose entire goods amounted to a brass pot, 2 wooden bowls, a kneading trough, and a single chest. The window held no glass, only a square of oiled linen drawn back at dawn. By the time the parish bells rang for prime, the door stood open, the hens had been let into the yard, and the day had begun. The first sun touched the thatch, and the smoke drifted out into a clear, cold sky. Beyond the cottages lay strips of plowland, narrow and uneven, divided among the village by ancient custom. The open field system shaped almost every village in northern France, England, and the Low Countries. Around the year 1340, a typical English manor practiced a 3-field rotation, 1 field sown in autumn with wheat or rye, 1 in spring with barley, oats, or peas, and 1 left fallow to graze. Each villain held scattered strips, perhaps 30 in all, totaling between 15 and 30 acres of arable land. The plow was a heavy-wheeled instrument, drawn by as many as 8 oxen pulled together from several households. Few families owned a full team alone. Geoffrey of Halesowen, named in a manor roll of 1334, shared his oxen with 3 neighbors. The plowing began after Michaelmas, the feast of St. Michael on the 29th of September, when the autumn fields were turned and sown. Boys of 7 or 8 walked alongside, breaking clods with mattocks. Girls scattered seed by hand from a wicker tray. Bird scaring was a child's task. A sling, a wooden clapper, a small voice. Wages, where paid, were recorded in the bailiff's accounts, a halfpenny a day at harvest, perhaps a quart of small ale at midday. The ridges and furrows of those fields still mark old English pastures today, faint corduroy beneath the grass when the low sun crosses them in winter. At noon the bells rang again, and the oxen rested in the headland. Above the village stood the manor house, sometimes only a stone hall with a thatched roof, where the lord or his bailiff held court. A villain owed his lord work, called week work, usually 2 or 3 days a week on the lord's demesne. The fields the manor kept for itself. He also owed boon work at harvest and at plowing, when every able body in the village turned out together. In addition, there were renders in kind, hens at Christmas, eggs at Easter, a portion of the year's grain ground at the lord's mill, for which he paid a multure of 1/16 or 1/20 of the meal. The manor court met 3 times a year in the great hall, presided over by the steward. Its rolls, many still preserved at the National Archives at Kew and in cathedral libraries, record disputes over boundary stones, wandering pigs, broken hedges, and unpaid heriots, the death due that took the best beast from a tenant's holding. After the great pestilence of 1348 to 1349, which contemporaries later called the Black Death, and which swept through England and the continent, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population, the court rolls grow thinner, and the names of empty holdings multiply. Tenants who survived began bargaining for lower rents, and the bonds of villainage loosened slowly across the next 2 generations. The steward closed the great roll and snuffed his candle, and the hall fell quiet. The medieval table was simpler than later centuries imagined, and almost everything began with grain. Bread was the foundation of the peasant diet. In England, a coarse loaf called maslin, made from a mixed flour of wheat and rye, was the everyday bread, pure white wheat bread, called pandemain, was reserved for feast days or for the Lord's table. Each household took its dough to the Lord's oven. Another small render owed to the manor, though many baked instead on a flat stone in the hearth ash. Alongside the bread came pottage, a thick, slow-simmered stew of oats or barley, with leeks, onions, beans, peas, and whatever cabbage or kale the garden offered. Meat was uncommon for villeins outside the armed slaughter, when a single pig was killed at Martinmas on the 11th of November, salted in a wooden trough, and hung from the rafters to last the winter. Cheese, butter, and curd, called the white meats, came from one or two cows or from a few sheep. The drink at every meal, even for children, was small ale, weak, freshly brewed, and safer than most well water. Form of curry, a royal cookery roll compiled around 1390 for the household of King Richard II, preserves several of the period's recipes, though most are far richer than anything a villain would taste. The pottage was set on the table in a single wooden bowl, and the family gathered close around it. The Christian calendar shaped the rhythm of the year more deeply than any clock could have done. Days were measured by the church's bells, matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, non is at mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep. Most villagers could not read, but they knew the saints' feasts as farmers know the weather. Candlemas on the 2nd of February marked the lengthening of the day. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany, returned men to the fields. Lady Day, on the 25th of March, began the legal year in England until the calendar reform of 1752, and it was the day rents fell due. Lammas, on the 1st of August, took its name from Loaf Mass, when a loaf made from the first wheat of the harvest was carried to the parish church to be blessed. St. Michael, at Michaelmas, closed the farming year. Between these feasts ran ember days of fasting and the 40 days of Lent, when meat and dairy were forbidden across all of Christendom. The parish church, often a small Norman building of stone with a thatched or shingled roof, served as the village's gathering place. Christenings, weddings, funerals, and the reading of royal proclamations all happened there. Whitewashed walls were painted with scenes from the Last Judgment and the lives of saints. The survivors of these wall paintings, in churches like Pickering in Yorkshire, still glow faintly above the pews. The bell rang for vespers, and the villagers turned their faces toward home. Once a week, the road to the nearest market town carried families with baskets, hampers, and small pack ponies. Most English villages lay within walking distance of a market, granted by royal charter and held one fixed day a week. The borough of St. Albans held its market on Saturdays under a charter of 2002. Stratford-upon-Avon held a Thursday market by grant of King John. Larger fairs ran for several days at midsummer or harvest, drawing peddlers, cloth merchants, leather workers, and pilgrims. A villain could not formally leave his manor without his lord's permission, but in practice short trips for trade and family visits were common and tolerated. Roads were unpaved tracks, often deep with mud in winter, the old Roman roads. Watling Street, Ermine Street, and the Fosse Way still carried much of England's traffic in the 1340s. Travelers walked between 15 and 20 miles in a day, less in poor weather, and lodged at religious houses, at hospitals dedicated to St. Leonard or St. Mary Magdalene, or at private inns recognized by a painted bush hung from a pole. The Canterbury Tales, which Geoffrey Chaucer began writing around 1387, drew its company of pilgrims from precisely this world: a knight, a miller, a wife from Bath, a parson, all riding a familiar route from Southwark toward the shrine of Thomas Becket. At evening the travelers paid their toll at the town gate and passed in beneath the lantern. As the western sky cooled, the villagers' day folded slowly inward toward the hearth. There were no clocks in most villages, only the angle of the sun and the parish bells. After vespers the family returned to the cottage. Supper was small, a piece of bread, the day's pottage warmed again, perhaps a wedge of cheese, and eaten at a trestle table that was lifted away when the meal was done. The single linen tablecloth was kept folded in the chest and brought out only on Sundays. Tallow candles, made from rendered sheep's fat, cast a small uneven light. Rushlights, dipped in fat and held in iron pincers, were cheaper still and more common in poor households. Wax candles were a luxury reserved for the church. The curfew bell rang at 8 in the evening in many English towns, an old Norman custom that required household fires to be banked for the night. Children were settled on their straw mattresses. The goodwife covered the embers with the iron lid. The latch dropped on the door. Outside, the village fell quiet, save for the dogs and the wind in the thatch. In summer, the long northern dusk stretched until the last light pooled along the ridge of the down. In winter, the dark closed in early, and the houses on either side of the lane glimmered for only a little while before they too went dark. The last ember dimmed beneath the iron lid, and the cottage settled into the long quiet of the night. From a single cottage in 14th-century Europe, the long quiet hours move on, as they have for so many before. More stories from the long quiet hours, every night on Sleepy Atlas. Rest gently and dream as the bells fade into the dark.